In today's episode, we're looking at 5 people who were killed by chimpanzees. From a veterinary technician who inherited her aunt's pet chimp, to a zookeeper whose overconfidence became his downfall. But first, we start in Connecticut, where one woman's attempt to comfort her agitated chimp turned a quiet evening into a nightmare. It was April 14th, 2016, and the spring air in Stamford, Connecticut carried the scent of blooming dogwoods and fresh-cut grass. Inside a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting gentle shadows across hardwood floors. To neighbors, it looked like any other suburban home. But behind those walls lived something that didn't belong. A 160-pound male chimpanzee named Coco. Jessica Morgan had never planned to own a chimpanzee. At 27, she was a dedicated veterinary technician at Stamford Animal Hospital, known for her gentle touch with frightened cats and her patience with difficult dogs. But when her eccentric Aunt Margaret died 6 months earlier, Jessica inherited more than just furniture and photo albums. She inherited Coco, a 12-year-old chimp Margaret had raised from infancy after purchasing him from a roadside zoo in the 1990s. Margaret had treated Coco like a human child, dressing him in clothes, letting him eat at the dinner table, and allowing him free run of the house. She'd ignored decades of warnings from animal control and exotic pet experts who tried to convince her that adult chimps were dangerous. When Jessica inherited Coco, she received the same warnings, but like her aunt, she dismissed them. Coco seemed so gentle, so human-like. He watched television, used silverware, and even helped with simple household tasks. What Jessica didn't understand was that chimpanzees are not domesticated animals. Even those raised from birth retain the strength of 5 grown men and the unpredictable instincts of wild primates. Adult male chimps can weigh up to 200 pounds, possess arms twice as strong as a human's, and can become violently territorial without warning. Their bite force exceeds 1,300 pounds per square inch, enough to crush bone. In the wild, they're known to kill members of rival troops with savage efficiency. That Thursday evening, Jessica had worked a double shift at the clinic. She'd also stopped by her salon for a trim and highlights, something she'd been planning for weeks. The new hairstyle made her feel confident, and she'd splurged on an expensive French perfume her coworker had recommended. She was excited to show off her new look, even if the only one home to see it was Coco. She unlocked the front door just after 7 p.m., calling out her usual greeting. But instead of Coco's typical excited hooting, she was met with an unsettling silence. She found him in the living room sitting rigidly on the couch, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity she'd never seen before. His lips were pulled back slightly, revealing his teeth, a warning sign she didn't recognize. The problem was scent. Chimpanzees rely heavily on smell to identify friend from foe, and Jessica's new perfume had masked her familiar odor. Combined with her altered appearance, Coco's primitive brain registered her as a stranger, an intruder in his territory. His posture grew more rigid, his breathing heavier. But Jessica, exhausted from her long day and focused on her excitement about her new look, misread the signs completely. Instead of backing away and giving Coco space to process her changed appearance, Jessica did exactly what she'd always done when he seemed upset. She approached him directly, arms outstretched, speaking in the soothing voice she used with anxious animals at work. "Hey buddy, it's me," she said softly, moving closer. "Look at my new hair. Don't I look pretty?" Coco exploded from the couch with terrifying speed, his 160 pounds of muscle launching directly at Jessica's chest. She barely had time to scream before his powerful hands grabbed her shoulders, his teeth sinking deep into her neck. The force knocked her backward onto the hardwood floor, her head striking the coffee table with a sickening crack. Coco's attack was savage and methodical. His jaws clamped down on her right hand, crushing bones and severing 3 fingers completely. Jessica's screams filled the house as he dragged her across the floor, his teeth tearing at her scalp and face. Blood pooled beneath her as Coco beat her with his fists, each blow delivered with the force of a sledgehammer. The attack lasted nearly 4 minutes, an eternity of violence that neighbors later said sounded like someone was being murdered. Miss Patterson next door called 911, reporting screams and what sounded like furniture being destroyed. When police arrived, they found the front door unlocked and followed the sounds of Jessica's weakening cries to the living room. Officer Martinez was the first through the door. He found Coco straddling Jessica's motionless body, blood covering his hands and mouth. The chimp looked up at the officer with calm, almost human-like eyes, as if nothing unusual had happened. Jessica lay beneath him, her face unrecognizable, her breathing shallow and labored. The officer drew his weapon and ordered Coco to move away, but the chimp simply tilted his head, curious about this new visitor. When Martinez stepped closer, Coco bared its teeth and moved protectively over Jessica's body. The officer had no choice. He fired 3 shots center mass, and Coco collapsed beside the woman he just destroyed. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Jessica, but the damage was catastrophic. She'd lost massive amounts of blood, suffered severe facial trauma, and sustained critical injuries to her neck and throat. She flatlined twice in the ambulance and was pronounced dead at Stanford Hospital at 8:47 p.m. The investigation revealed that Jessica had received multiple warnings about keeping Coco. Animal control had visited twice in the past year, and her veterinary colleagues had repeatedly urged her to contact a primate sanctuary. But like her aunt before her, Jessica had believed love was enough to keep her safe. Connecticut strengthened its exotic animal laws within 6 months, but for Jessica, the change came too late. Jessica's story was a brutal reminder that wild animals remain wild no matter how long they live in our homes. For Michael Torres, it wasn't inexperience that proved fatal, but overconfidence built over years of working with chimps. It was August 17, 2015, and the humid New York summer had settled over the Bronx Zoo like a heavy blanket. In the Congo Gorilla Forest exhibit, the morning routine was just beginning. Feeding schedules, enclosure cleaning, and the careful choreography that kept both animals and staff safe. For most keepers, safety protocols were sacred, but for 35-year-old Michael Torres, rules had become suggestions he increasingly chose to ignore. Michael had worked with primates for 8 years, starting as an intern fresh out of college and working his way up to senior keeper. He was known for his intuitive understanding of chimp behavior, his ability to calm agitated animals, and his growing belief that experience trumped protocol. Colleagues respected his knowledge but worried about his methods. Michael had a habit of bending rules, taking shortcuts, and trusting his instincts over established safety procedures. The trouble had started 3 months earlier when Michael was passed over for the head keeper position, a promotion he'd been certain was his. The job went to someone with less field experience but better adherence to safety standards. The rejection stung, and Michael began taking increasingly dangerous risks to prove his expertise. He'd entered enclosures alone, ignored backup requirements, and dismissed the concerns of younger staff members who questioned his methods. The Bronx Zoo's primate facility housed 12 chimpanzees in a complex social hierarchy that shifted constantly. Bruno, the dominant male, was a 180-pound powerhouse who'd recently faced challenges to his authority from younger males. The stress had made him increasingly territorial and unpredictable, warning signs that Michael either missed or chose to ignore. Chimpanzees are deceptively powerful animals. Their muscle density is nearly twice that of humans, and their long arms provide tremendous leverage for striking and grappling. Bruno weighed 180 pounds of pure muscle, with canine teeth over an inch long and hands capable of crushing bone. When threatened or challenged, they can become explosively violent without warning. That morning's cleaning schedule called for Bruno's enclosure to be serviced while the chimp was secured in a separate holding area. Zoo protocol required 2 keepers for any work involving the dominant male, one to monitor Bruno's location and behavior, the other to perform the actual cleaning. But Michael's backup had called in sick, and rather than wait for a replacement, he decided to handle the job alone. Michael had done this before without incident. He was confident in his ability to read Bruno's moods, and trusted that 8 years of experience had taught him everything he needed to know about chimp behavior. What he didn't realize was that Bruno's recent territorial disputes had left him in a state of heightened aggression, primed to attack anything he perceived as a threat to his dominance. The enclosure was a spacious habitat designed to mimic African forest conditions, complete with climbing structures, ropes, and multiple levels. Michael entered through the keeper access door, carrying cleaning supplies and moving with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. He didn't notice that the door to Bruno's holding area hadn't fully latched, a mechanical failure that would prove fatal. Bruno had been pacing in the holding area, agitated by the sounds and scents of cleaning chemicals. When the faulty latch gave way, he found himself face to face with Michael in the main enclosure. For a moment, both man and chimp froze, each assessing the other. Then Bruno's territorial instincts exploded into violence. Bruno launched himself at Michael with explosive speed, covering the 15-foot distance in less than 2 seconds. His powerful hands grabbed Michael by the throat, lifting the keeper off his feet before slamming him against the concrete wall. The impact drove the air from Michael's lungs and sent his cleaning supplies scattering across the floor. The chimp's attack was methodical and devastating. Bruno bit down on Michael's face, his inch-long canines tearing through flesh and crushing the orbital bones around his left eye. Michael's screams echoed through the facility as Bruno began beating him against the wall, each impact accompanied by the sickening sound of bones breaking. Other staff members heard the commotion and rushed to the observation windows, but they were helpless to intervene. Bruno had Michael pinned against the far wall, too far from any emergency access point. The chimp's powerful hands gripped Michael's head, slamming it repeatedly against the concrete while his teeth tore at the keeper's neck and shoulders. Dr. Sarah Chen, the facility's veterinarian, arrived with a tranquilizer rifle, but getting a clear shot was impossible with Bruno and Michael locked together in violent struggle. For nearly 3 minutes, staff could only watch in horror as Bruno continued his savage attack, Michael's movements growing weaker with each passing second. When Dr. Chen finally got her shot, the tranquilizer took another 2 minutes to take effect. Bruno gradually slowed his assault, his grip loosening as the drugs took hold. He stepped back from Michael's motionless body, swaying slightly before collapsing onto the enclosure floor. Michael lay crumpled against the blood-stained wall, his face destroyed beyond recognition, his skull fractured in multiple places. Paramedics worked for 20 minutes trying to stabilize him, but the damage was too severe. He was pronounced dead at Bronx Lebanon Hospital at 11:43 a.m. The investigation revealed multiple safety violations. Michael had entered the enclosure alone, failed to verify that Bruno was properly secured, and ignored protocols designed to prevent exactly this type of incident. The faulty latch was repaired, but investigators determined that proper procedure would have caught the mechanical failure before it became deadly. Bruno was not euthanized, as zoo officials determined he had acted according to his natural instincts. New safety measures were implemented, including mandatory 2-person teams for all primate work. Michael's overconfidence in a controlled environment proved fatal. For Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the danger came from the wild itself and a moment of poor judgment in the forest of Tanzania. It was June 19, 2017, and the morning mist clung to the canopy of Gombe Stream National Park like a living thing. In the dense forest of Tanzania, where Jane Goodall had first studied wild chimpanzees decades earlier, the sounds of the awakening jungle created a symphony of hoots, calls, and rustling leaves. For 31-year-old Dr. Sarah Mitchell, this was paradise, a place where she could observe our closest relatives in their natural habitat and gather data that would complete her PhD dissertation. Sarah had been studying the Kasakela chimpanzee community for 18 months, documenting their social behaviors, territorial disputes, and complex hierarchies. She was a dedicated primatologist from UC Berkeley, known for her meticulous research methods and her ability to remain calm in the presence of wild chimps. Her colleagues respected her work, but some worried about her tendency to work alone in the forest, often for hours at a time. The research station at Gombe was a small collection of buildings perched on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, staffed by a handful of researchers and local guides. Sarah had grown comfortable with the routine: early morning treks into the forest, long hours of observation, and detailed notes about every interaction she witnessed. She'd learned to recognize individual chimps by their faces, their calls, and their unique behavioral patterns. What Sarah understood intellectually but hadn't fully internalized was that wild chimpanzees are not the peaceful creatures often portrayed in documentaries. They're capable of extreme violence, particularly during territorial disputes between rival groups. Male chimps regularly engage in brutal warfare, killing members of neighboring communities with savage efficiency. These conflicts can last for hours and involve multiple animals in states of heightened aggression. Wild chimpanzees in territorial disputes enter a state of extreme aggression that can last for hours. Their adrenaline levels spike, their perception narrows, and they become capable of explosive violence against anything they perceive as a threat. A full-grown male can weigh over 180 pounds, stand nearly 4 feet tall, and possess the strength to tear a human limb from limb. That morning, Sarah had been tracking the Kasakala group's alpha male, Frodo, and his coalition of supporters as they patrolled the southern boundary of their territory. She'd positioned herself about 50 feet away, hidden behind a fallen log with her notebook and camera, documenting their movements and vocalizations. The chimps seemed calm, moving slowly through the forest and occasionally stopping to feed on figs. The situation changed dramatically when a rival group from the neighboring Matumba community appeared on a ridge about 100 yards away. Sarah watched through her binoculars as the two groups spotted each other, their peaceful demeanor instantly transforming into aggressive posturing. The males began hooting loudly, their hair standing on end, their movements becoming jerky and unpredictable. Sarah had witnessed territorial displays before, but always from a safe distance with other researchers nearby. This time, she was alone, and the two groups were positioning themselves on either side of her hiding spot. She should have retreated immediately, but her scientific curiosity overrode her survival instincts. This was exactly the type of intergroup conflict she needed to document for her dissertation. As the tension escalated, Sarah made a critical error in judgment. Instead of backing away from the confrontation, she moved closer, trying to get better photographs and more detailed behavioral observations. She positioned herself in a small clearing between the two groups, believing that the chimps were too focused on each other to pay any attention to her. The attack began when Kessie, a large male from the Kasakala group, broke away from his coalition and charged toward the rival chimps. Sarah was directly in his path, and in his heightened state of aggression, she became a target for his redirected fury. He slammed into her with the force of a linebacker, his 140 pounds of muscle knocking her to the ground and sending her camera flying into the underbrush. Kessie's attack was savage and relentless. His powerful hands grabbed Sarah's head, his inch-long canine sinking deep into her scalp and face. She screamed and tried to protect herself with her arms, but Kessie was joined by two other males who saw her as either a threat or an opportunity to display their aggression. The three chimps took turns mauling her, their teeth tearing at her limbs while their powerful hands beat her against the forest floor. The attack lasted nearly 10 minutes, an eternity of violence in the remote wilderness. Sarah's radio calls for help went unanswered due to her isolated location, and by the time she finally stopped moving, the chimps had gradually lost interest and wandered away, leaving her broken body in the clearing. Search teams found her remains 2 days later, partially consumed by the very animal she dedicated her life to studying. The investigation concluded that Sarah had violated basic safety protocols by working alone during a territorial dispute and positioning herself between rival groups. New requirements were implemented for field researchers, including mandatory backup personnel and improved communication systems. But for Sarah, the changes came too late. Sarah's death led to stricter safety requirements for field researchers. For Rebecca Walsh, the danger came from a chimp she thought she could trust. It was October 12, 2014, and autumn had painted the Louisiana countryside in shades of gold and amber. At Chimp Haven Sanctuary, nestled among towering pine trees and rolling hills, 29-year-old Rebecca Walsh was preparing for what would be her final shift with the retired research chimps she'd grown to love. Rebecca had been volunteering at the sanctuary for 3 years, working with chimps rescued from medical research facilities. She was emotionally invested in their rehabilitation and often stayed late to spend extra time with them. Recently going through a difficult divorce, she found comfort in her work and had developed a special bond with Kira, a female chimp with a history of severe abuse. Kira had spent 15 years in a medical research facility, subjected to painful procedures and kept in isolation. The trauma had left her with deep psychological scars. She was prone to sudden mood swings, aggressive outbursts, and periods of severe depression. Most volunteers were wary of her, but Rebecca saw past the aggression to the wounded animal beneath. The sanctuary housed over 300 chimpanzees on 200 acres of forested land, providing them with as natural an environment as possible after years of captivity. Strict protocols governed all human-chimp interactions, especially with animals like Kira, who had histories of trauma and unpredictable behavior. The rules existed for good reason. Even female chimps possess incredible strength and can inflict devastating injuries when triggered. Rebecca had spent countless hours talking to Kira through the enclosure bars, bringing her favorite treats, and slowly earning what she believed was trust. She'd watched Kira's gradual improvement over the months, celebrating small victories like the chimp accepting food from her hand or responding to her voice. But trauma runs deep in these animals, and their capacity for sudden violence never fully disappears. That evening, Rebecca noticed Kira sitting alone in the corner of her enclosure, refusing to eat and showing signs of severe depression. The chimp had been displaying increased aggression toward other volunteers over the past week, but Rebecca attributed this to Kira's traumatic past rather than recognizing it as a warning sign of escalating instability. Sanctuary protocols required 2-person teams for all chimp interactions, especially during feeding time when the animals were most territorial and unpredictable. But Rebecca had grown overconfident in her relationship with Kira. She believed their bond transcended the normal rules, and that her presence alone could comfort the distressed animal. Against all protocols and her supervisor's explicit instructions, Rebecca made the fatal decision to enter Kira's enclosure alone during feeding time. She believed her special relationship with the chimp made her safe and wanted to comfort Kira personally during what appeared to be an episode of severe depression. She approached slowly, speaking in the soothing tones that had always calmed Kira before, carrying the chimp's favorite fruit as a peace offering. "Hey girl," she whispered softly. "I know you're hurting. Let me help you feel better." But Kira, triggered by memories of past trauma and viewing Rebecca's approach during her vulnerable state as threatening rather than comforting, exploded into violence. Years of suppressed rage and pain erupted in an instant. The 140-pound chimp launched herself at Rebecca with explosive fury, her powerful jaws clamping down on Rebecca's face while her hands beat her with incredible strength. Rebecca's screams of shock and agony echoed through the facility as Kira's attack intensified. The chimp's teeth tore through flesh and bone, while her powerful hands grabbed Rebecca's head and slammed it repeatedly against the concrete floor. Blood pooled rapidly beneath them as Kira continued her savage assault, driven by instincts and trauma that no amount of human kindness could overcome. Other volunteers heard the screams and rushed to the enclosure, but they were helpless to intervene safely. Protocol required trained staff with tranquilizer equipment to handle such situations. But by the time help arrived, Kira had already inflicted fatal injuries to Rebecca's head and neck. When sanctuary staff finally managed to sedate Kira and reach Rebecca, she was barely clinging to life. Her face was destroyed beyond recognition, her skull fractured in multiple places, and she'd lost massive amounts of blood. She died from her injuries before paramedics could stabilize her for transport. The investigation revealed that Rebecca had violated multiple safety protocols by entering the enclosure alone and approaching an agitated animal during feeding time. New measures were implemented to prevent similar incidents, including enhanced security systems and stricter enforcement of team requirements. Kira was not euthanized, as officials determined she had acted according to her traumatized instincts, but she was moved to a more secure facility. Rebecca's story showed how emotional attachment can cloud judgment when dealing with traumatized animals. For Tommy Rodriguez, greed and ignorance proved an even deadlier combination. It was February 28, 2013, and the Texas sun beat down mercilessly on a remote ranch where 42-year-old Tommy Rodriguez ran an illegal exotic animal dealing operation with his partner Jake. The sprawling property, hidden behind rusted gates and overgrown mesquite trees, housed a collection of animals that should never have been in private hands. Tommy and Jake had been running their operation for 5 years, buying and selling exotic animals to wealthy collectors who didn't ask questions about permits or legality. The money was good. A single chimpanzee could fetch $15,000 or more, but the conditions were horrific. Animals were kept in cramped, unsanitary cages with minimal food and no veterinary care. Tommy had no formal training with primates, but considered himself experienced after years in the illegal trade. He'd learned to handle the animals through trial and error, developing a dangerous overconfidence that ignored the warning signs of stressed and increasingly aggressive chimps. The animals were malnourished, psychologically damaged, and growing more unpredictable by the day. Caesar, their largest male, was a 170-pound chimp who'd been confined in a 6-by-8-foot cage for 8 months. The prolonged captivity had driven him to the edge of madness. He paced constantly, beat his chest against the bars until they bled, and displayed extreme stress behaviors that Tommy dismissed as normal chimp behavior. The animal's eyes had taken on a wild, desperate look that should have warned anyone with sense to stay away. Chimpanzees are not meant for captivity, especially in the conditions Tommy provided. In the wild, they roam territories spanning miles, live in complex social groups, and engage in sophisticated behaviors. Confined alone in a small space, they develop severe psychological disorders that manifest as extreme aggression and unpredictable violence. That morning, Tommy received a call from a buyer in Houston willing to pay $18,000 for Caesar, money they desperately needed to keep their operation running and avoid bankruptcy. The buyer was arriving that afternoon and expected the Chimp to be ready for transport. Against Jake's advice and his own better judgment, Tommy decided to move Caesar to the transport cage alone. Jake had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with their operation, especially after witnessing Caesar's deteriorating mental state. He'd suggested they contact a sanctuary or at least hire someone with proper training, but Tommy dismissed his concerns as weakness. The money was too good, and Tommy's ego wouldn't allow him to admit he was in over his head. Tommy entered the cage area carrying a tranquilizer dart, planning to sedate Caesar before the transfer. But he underestimated both the animal's strength and his own desperation. Caesar had been watching, waiting, and when the cage door opened, he saw his chance for freedom or revenge. Caesar exploded in a violent rage the moment Tommy stepped within reach. 8 months of confinement, abuse, and psychological torture erupted in an instant of pure fury. The Chimp grabbed Tommy with hands that could crush bone and began mauling him with savage intensity, his teeth tearing into Tommy's face while his powerful arms beat him against the cage bars. Tommy's screams brought Jake running, but when he tried to help, Caesar turned on him as well, slashing his arm and throwing him against the wall. The Chimp then returned to Tommy, continuing his brutal assault with methodical precision. Blood covered the cage floor as Caesar vented years of rage and frustration on the man who had tormented him. Jake managed to call 911 despite his injuries, but the remote location meant help was 20 minutes away. By the time sheriff's deputies arrived, Tommy was barely alive, his face destroyed and his body broken from the sustained attack. Caesar was still in the cage, covered in blood but finally calm, as if the violence had purged something from his tortured mind. Deputies had no choice but to shoot Caesar when he showed aggression toward the paramedics trying to reach Tommy. The Chimp died instantly. His suffering finally ended. Tommy was rushed to the hospital but died from his injuries during surgery, his illegal operation finally claiming its ultimate price. The investigation shut down the ranch and led to federal charges against Jake, who survived but faced years in prison for wildlife trafficking. The remaining animals were relocated to accredited sanctuaries, though many were too damaged psychologically to ever fully recover. Tommy's death became a landmark case that resulted in tougher penalties for exotic animal trafficking across Texas. Thanks for watching this video. Just when you think you understand the bond between humans and animals, we're just getting started. Click the next video for more stories that'll show you how quickly trust can turn deadly.